Chapter. And welcome to almost the end of your first semester. Couple of announcements. Number one, of course, as usual, please turn off your electronics. Do that. Second, I've gotten word that there has been a little bit of shifting around in sections for next term. I think for registering, you can't do that, okay, unless there is some sort of special dispensation. I know there's some circumstances where people found themselves I don't know, whatever it is. If you are not in the section with the same faculty member that you are this term, then without special permission, then you got to back out of that section, and then we got to get you into the correct section. Okay? So please do that. Leave that section. Don't worry. You will get into University 150B. Don't worry about that. You know, whether we can do that immediately or not, I don't know exactly. By the time spring term begins, you will have those 5 units. Okay? But you can, on your own, just jump into another section. All right? If somebody has a real, true reason why they can't take the same section, then they need to talk to their professor. All right? Anything from Emily?
Roundtable today with Steve in the Cooperage.
Roundtable today with Steve in the Cooperage. Okay, our speaker today is Dr. Stephen Estes, Jr. Our host. He is a professor in the Department of History. Highly sought after classes. One of the most highly regarded teachers on campus. He's going to talk today about a place where he's from, right? He's a Southerner, born in the Carolinas. South Carolina? South Carolina. And so his PhD is in history from University of South Carolina or North Carolina? Sorry. Yeah, not a good lesson. My mistake. He's done all kinds of amazing things. Traveled all around. He worked in something called the Southern Oral History Program. Was that before your PhD or after? While you were doing your PhD. I want to ask him some questions about that in the roundtable. He's not going to talk about it right now. He has one or is now a counselor at the Interlochen Arts Campus. Used to be. A lot of things. He's an accomplished guitarist and musician. He has written a lot of stuff, a long record of scholarly achievement, including two books, right? Like, for instance, White Masculinity in the Southern South, right? Yes? That would be very fascinating to read. He is currently working on a project that's all about the peanut butter jelly sandwich. Is that right? The history of peanut butter jelly sandwich. Please give a very warm FYE welcome to Dr.
Yeah, so can you hear me all right? All right. All right, cool. So this is a book I wrote, and it came out last year, and it's about my hometown, like Scott said, Charleston. And so I am going to be talking about that, the book, and really Charleston from the civil rights movement up to today, basically. But before I get too deep into that, you're probably wondering where the hell is Charleston? And so let's show you on a map. So here it is. How many of y'all ever been to Charleston? Raise your hands. Oh, a lot of people. Whoa, that's crazy. All right. The reason that people know Charleston is because it's where the Civil War started. Fort Sumter is in the harbor, and that's where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. But it's in South Carolina, you see there. And the biggest cities nearby are Charlotte, which is actually where I was born. And in Charleston, if you're from North Carolina, they say you're a Yankee. That's not quite right, but it is a joke around town. And Atlanta is the other big city nearby. But Charleston, much cooler than both of those places. And I hope you'll want to visit after we finish, despite the fact that you'll hear that I have mixed feelings about my hometown. All right, so here we go. The next thing I want to do is I want you to tell me some stereotypes about my home region. Now, we'll start with the positives first. What are some of the stereotypes about Southerners? Yeah, give me one. They make great, not good. What are you talking about, good? They make great barbecue. Now, in South Carolina, we have a mustard-based barbecue that's really, really tasty. You probably never had that. So if you get a chance, definitely have it. Yeah.
Big trucks and country music?
Big trucks and country music. Thank you very much. As you walked in, I afflicted your eardrums with Darius Rucker. His song Wagon Wheel, it got played so much in 2013 that some bars actually banned the song. They were like, no more fucking Darius Rucker. But he lives in Charleston now. He's actually from a different part of South Carolina, but he lives in Charleston now. So, yes, and big trucks. And in fact, I wrote a country song about my brother's camouflage truck called Redneck Machine. Sadly, he had to give up that truck when he had 2 kids, and now he has a minivan, but that's how it goes. All right, any other positive stereotypes about the South? Yeah.
Everybody has good manners.
Yes, they have good manners, that's right. Now, unfortunately, when I moved to California, I became an a-hole. But when I was in South Carolina, I was a gentleman. And that is a good positive stereotype. Now, let's flip. Let's go to negative stereotypes. What are some of the negative stereotypes about the South? Yeah.
Everybody has bad teeth.
We do. That's true. I mean, these buck teeth you see here. These have had braces on them. Man, if you'd seen me 15 years ago, it was scary. All right. What else? What other bad stereotypes? Negative stereotypes? Yeah. Racist. They're racist. That's right. And we're going to talk all about that today, as a matter of fact. Any other negative stereotypes about the South? Yeah. They're redneck hillbillies. So not only are they racist, they're stupid and poor. And maybe all three at the same time, right? And they got bad teeth. Wow, I would say that's more, what's a quadfecta? I don't even know what that is. Okay, well those are bad stereotypes. Now, I've been, in this lecture so far, I've been talking with a Southern accent. And I hope that you realize that was intentional. I don't talk like that normally. But when I grew up, I did. And when I went to college, actually, and was sitting in not exactly the seats where you're sitting, but when I was a freshman in college, I intentionally got rid of my accent. Intentionally. Because I thought that Southerners were dumb, racist, redneck hillbillies. And so if I sounded like that, I must be a dumb, racist, redneck hillbilly. And so you can tell I have a pretty complicated relationship with my identity and my heritage being from Charleston, South Carolina. And I hope over the course of the day you'll see why that relationship is complicated, but also I will say that I have come to embrace some of the things about my Southern heritage that I think are good. Not just look critically at the negative stereotypes, but also embrace some of the positive stereotypes and other attributes, not just stereotypes. All right, so I am a historian, and I want to talk a little bit about the long history of Charleston before I talk about actually what the research was about. I started this book with a research question, and when you do a research paper, you need to have a question that you want to answer. So you can see there's a red line through part of it. The question I really wanted to write a book about was, how did the Civil Rights Movement change the South? But that was too big. I couldn't do the entire South. And so I had to narrow my focus of my research to focus on one place. And for me, it was obvious that that place should be my hometown, Charleston. And I think throughout your college career, you're going to have this happen, where you are assigned a research paper and you think, let's say it's a history paper, I'm going to write about World War II. And World War II, there are multi-volume works on World War II. You can't write a 10-page research paper on World War II. So you have to narrow that down, as I did with this topic. All right, so what's my argument? When you're writing your response paper, this is probably going to be important for you, so I'll give you a second to write this down. But basically, my argument really was the second part of the book. In the book, the second thing was what I was arguing. But basically, here's what it boils down to. During this era of segregation, or Jim Crow, race defined power in the South. Yes, there were class differences in the South. Gender was important in the South. Sexuality was important in the South. All kinds of factors play into power. But if you had to boil it down to one factor that was more important than anything else, it was race. Interestingly enough, and I did not go into my research thinking this was going to be my argument, I actually thought race was still the main factor. And we can debate. I'll give you counter arguments for my thesis as we go through. But over the course of doing the research, I came to believe that actually class was as important. It grew more important in the post-civil rights era, so that it was as important as race in defining power in the South. So here's the long history, or a deep history, of race in Charleston. So Charleston is sometimes called the Black Ellis Island because 40% of African Americans who were brought here as slaves in the 1700s came through the port of Charleston. And as a result of that, and also as a result of rice plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco plantations, indigo plantations, the majority of Charlestonians from the early colonial era, 1710, up through the 20th century, 1930, the majority of Charlestonians were black. And in fact, when I was growing up, when I was born, the majority of Charleston City residents, and I was a Charleston City resident, was African American as well. The county had shifted, and we'll talk about that, why that was in a second. The other thing you need to know about Charleston is that Charleston in the 1700s was the fourth biggest city in what would become the United States, behind Boston, New York, Philadelphia. So it was an incredibly important place in early American history. And it was one of the wealthiest places in America. Now, half of that wealth was held in slaves. So after the Civil War, Charleston it went from being one of the wealthiest places in America very quickly to being one of the poorest places in America. And that drop had a dramatic effect on Charleston in the 20th century, even though it happened in the 19th century. Some people say that Charleston in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, it was a quaint place. You know, it was a place where one of the reasons why people go there is because it still looks like it looked in the 19th century. It's a very low skyline, but a beautiful skyline. And so you feel like you're stepping into history when you go there. But one of the reasons why you feel that way is because Charleston was too poor to develop. It was said that Charlestonians were too proud to paint and too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash. And so that kind of captures the town in the late 19th, early 20th century. All right. Well, that poverty bred a certain type of racism in Charleston. And it bred a legal racism, which you know as slavery, or sometimes it's called Jim Crow. So to separate the races, and I gave you a picture, most people think of bus boycotts in Montgomery because the segregated buses there made African Americans sit in the back. That was true across the South. And this is a picture of a Charleston bus in 1956, and you can see the white folks are sitting in the front and the black folks are sitting in the far back. Historians and sociologists at the time, mostly black sociologists at the time and historians now, talk about segregation as a way to control class tensions and to solidify racial loyalties. So the idea was, by segregating the working class, you could actually control both the white working class and the black working class. And you could politically control black elites by taking away the right to vote from African Americans. All this is part of the early 20th century history of Charleston. And it's really part of the early 20th century of the South. Now, one of the things I think, when I read about this the first time, it really kind of blew my mind, this idea of psychological wages. sociologist and historian named W.B. Du Bois came up with this idea in the early 20th century. And the idea is this: if you segregate white and black people in the South, especially working class white and black people, then you can pay both groups shit and they won't get together to demand higher wages. The white people may be getting crap, but the elites say to the white folks, the white working class, well, you may be getting paid shit, but at least you're white. And that is the psychological wage of segregation, right? You're not actually getting any more money. You can't eat whiteness. It's like, oh man, this whiteness tastes delicious. Have some of that for Thanksgiving. No, but it makes you feel more dignified. And so it kept the working class separate. This is actually a Marxist analysis of segregation. So let's look at this graph. This is a population graph for Charleston County, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, but I actually want to ask you a question about it. What happens right here in the 1930s? Why does the population switch after the 1920s, or during the 1920s and 30s, from being a black majority in Charleston County to being a white majority? What happens there? What happens in African American history in the 1920s, or 30s, or 40s? Well, who said that? Yeah, that's right. What's that called? Do you remember what that's called? They do all move up north. They don't all move up north, but many of them move up north. Why? Who knows what that's called? When African Americans, many of them leave the South in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. What's that called? Yes, I heard somebody say it. It's a lot more awkward for you than it is for me. I'm getting paid to just stand here. No one knows what it's called? I heard somebody even say it. Okay, yeah. Oh, that's a good guess. It's not quite the Harlem Renaissance, but the Harlem Renaissance is a result of this in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's the Great Migration. That's right. Thank you. See, you all knew. I knew you knew. Yeah, so it's the Great Migration. And basically, segregation and Jim Crow push African Americans out of the South, and jobs pull them out of the South. You can get a better job in New York or Detroit or Boston or D.C., and you can't get any money being a sharecropper in rural South Carolina. What are you going to do? You're going to get the hell out of Dodge and move to New York, D.C., Detroit, whatever. And that's what happens here in this period. And you see, this is not something I'm going to talk a lot about, but something else interesting happens in the 2000s. Why does the black population flatline in Charleston County in the 2000s? And in fact, the city population of African Americans declines starting in the 1980s or 90s, but it accelerates in the 2000s. Does anyone have an idea why that might happen? It happens, it's not just Charleston. It's happened in San Francisco, Oakland, D.C., Detroit. What happens in the 90s and 2000s that makes the percentage of the African American population decline in cities? Yeah?
Was it like the real estate in suburbs?
Not in suburbs, actually, but it is the boom in real estate, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's gentrification. And so you think, when you think gentrification, you probably think New York or San Francisco. You wouldn't think a place like Charleston, which is way off the beaten path, would have gentrification, but that happens there too. And that's one of the reasons why I like population graphs. I mean, first of all, I'm a nerd, so get that. But then after that, they tell you about the history of a place. And you can see this boom right here. This boom coincides with basically a post-war boom in the South. Two things are happening in the South. One, the economic center of gravity is pushing southward in this country so that you have a Sun Belt boom. And the second thing that happens is that there's a lot of military installations in the South. And so during the Cold War, the federal government pumps money into places like Charleston. And that changes the dynamics of the economic dynamics of the South. And in some ways, some people have argued, although I didn't argue this, but some people have argued that boom paves the way for the civil rights movement. And I'll get back to that in just a second. All right, when you do a research project, you have to do what is called a literature review. You have to look at what other scholars have published about your topic and then figure out how what your research question relates to what they have decided. In history, that literature review is called historiography. So it's the history of history. It's the history of how history is written. So when I started doing this research, I said, okay, wait a second. What have other people said about civil rights in small places or the post-civil rights era in small places? And they said 3 things. So I want you to write all 3 of these down, not these 3 books. Do not write all 3 of these books down. This is part 1 of 3 parts of historiography. The first part is really short, is called local movement histories. There was an explosion of histories of the civil rights movement in small places all over the country. And these are 3 of them. This one is in Greensboro. This is one of my advisors at Duke. I actually went to North Carolina, and I hate Duke for basketball purposes. But for scholastic purposes, it's a phenomenal school. And this is one of my advisors. He wrote a book about Greensboro, North Carolina. This is a book about rural Mississippi, where I've worked and lived. And then this is actually a book about Charleston. So it's a collection of essays about Charleston and race relations. So these 3 books are examples. There's a whole host of books like that. And here was my problem with that literature. Because it looked at small places, it could give you a long period of time. So these were about the civil rights movement. So we think of the civil rights movement, the heyday of the civil rights movement, as 1954 with the Brown decision, up to about 1965 or 68. But local histories took that and expanded it. They did the whole 20th century, and that was great. But these histories didn't have a consensus about whether the civil rights movement was a success or a failure. It kind of depended a little bit on the perspective of the historian, but it also, I think, and after I did my research, this was my argument, basically, if they looked at the middle and upper class of African Americans who got more opportunities after the civil rights movement, then they could say, yes, the civil rights movement in these small places was a success. But if they looked at the working class, or even lower, below working class of African Americans, they saw increased segregation and worse poverty after the civil rights movement. So those people looked at the civil rights movement as a failure. I think both of those things are true. And I think there aren't enough historians who acknowledge that both of those things are legacies of the movement. All right, so that's historiography part 1. Here's historiography part 2, or literature review part 2. And this one is, again, pretty short. Basically, the long civil rights movement. This is my main advisor at UNC came up with this idea that we shouldn't just look at the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968. That's the classic civil rights movement. But she argued that no, civil rights have been fought for at least since the beginning of the 20th century, and they were people continued to fight for them up into the 1990s and 2000s. And I agree with that. And so I actually would put my argument within that longer argument about a long civil rights struggle. And you can see 2 examples of this from 2015, just last year, in Charleston. This is a protest at Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church, and I hope that you know about the tragedy that happened there when parishioners were massacred by this guy named Dylan Roof. He's actually on trial right now in Charleston for murder. And then this is a Black Lives Matter protest in Charleston about a police shooting that happened actually in North Charleston. And sadly, the first trial of that officer ended in a hung jury just Monday. And so there will be more protests about that, as a matter of fact. But basically, my argument is similar to Jacqueline Hall's argument that the civil rights movement didn't just stop in 1968, that people continued to fight for rights and power after 1968, but they did so without as much federal government support and without as much of a grassroots movement. All right. And here's the last of the scholarly literature. Again, you don't need to write all these books down. So these are all colleagues of mine, and they all teach at way better schools than Sonoma State, sadly. But they're all really smart, but I wanted to take them on in terms of scholarship. So Lisa McGurr, Kevin Cruz, and Matt Lassiter wrote about the conservative counter-civil rights movement. And what they did was they looked at suburban histories, basically, of, in this case, Orange County, California, in this case, Atlanta, Georgia, and in this case, Charlotte, North Carolina. And they said, if you look at these suburbs from the 60s through the 90s, you see the seeds of the Republican Revolution. A backlash to the civil rights movement in the suburbs, which, as someone up here said, boomed in this period, and began to vote more conservatively. And in fact, they began to vote for Republicans. That explains how the Republican Revolution began, and it sustains it from the election of Richard Nixon, who you see on the cover of this book, through Ronald Reagan, and even through George W. Bush. My problem with this literature was this. How many of you have seen a picture of the states, the Electoral College map from the presidential elections? What color is the South? Is there any non-red part of the South? Like if I put up Trump's victory, what would South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, what would they look like? All red, right? Completely red. So that feeds into the stereotype that, I hate to say that red equals redneck. It does not, of course. But it does feed into the stereotype, right? That everyone in the South is conservative, that everyone in the South votes the same way. And that these electoral maps, I think, are disingenuous. They're misleading because, yes, of course, all of South Carolina's electors are going to vote for Trump because the majority of South Carolinians did. But what about, the 38% that didn't vote for Trump? Where are they in that sea of red? So that confused me because these books tended to reinforce what I call the CNN narrative of national politics, that the South is a monolithic conservative bloc. Because I knew growing up in Charleston that wasn't the case. In fact, the South can show us two things that challenge that political narrative. One, cities in the South like Charleston were the seat of deep blue Democrats. A biracial coalition of white and black Democrats ran almost every single southern city from 1975 up until today. And the second way that I think you can challenge that monolithic conservative South is you would think that those Democrats are the people that helped elect African Americans to Congress starting in the 1990s. And that is not true, as we'll see in just a second. It's in fact the Republican Party that makes that happen. So what are the primary sources for my research? Here they are. Newspaper articles, census records, school district documents, court cases, and most importantly for me, oral history interviews. As you can tell, I like talking, but I also like listening to people. And that's how I get most of my information, because I study the recent past. And what better way to study the recent past than by listening to the people who made the history that you're studying? That's what oral history is. That's a little plug for doing oral history. Now, there are problems with oral history, too. And we can talk about those maybe in the roundtable, but I think it's one of the best ways to study the past. All right, so in the remaining time that I've left, I want to talk about 4 case studies. They're really chapters in my book. And now you can use those chapters to figure out to what extent do you agree with or disagree with my thesis about class becoming as important as race in the South. Now this is not one of the case studies, so I just want to talk briefly about the Civil Rights Movement, because mostly I'm focusing on the post-Civil Rights Movement. So in terms of the Civil Rights Movement, if you've never heard of the Civil Rights Movement in Charleston, don't worry, you're not alone. It wasn't that important. The national media rarely came to Charleston. There weren't fire hoses and police dogs. Well, there were fire hoses and police dogs, but they didn't get on the national news because there wasn't a dramatic confrontation between civil rights activists and local authorities. The only dramatic one comes in 1969 when Martin Luther King was assassinated the year before, so his widow, Coretta Scott King, came to Charleston for a hospital worker strike that was the 15 moments of fame of the Charleston Civil Rights Movement. These other two folks you don't need to know, except for Septima Clark was one of Martin Luther King's closest advisors, especially on education. They were actually really good friends, and she was also friends with Rosa Parks and trained in nonviolence with Rosa Parks. But she's an activist from Charleston. So here's the first case study. The 4 case studies are this: local politics, policing, schools, and state politics. So those are the 4 things I'm going to want you to write down. And this is the local politics. So that guy on the right is called Little Black Joe. Why are you laughing? Well, what's funny about calling that guy Little Black Joe? And it is funny. Why is it weird to call a white dude Little Black Joe? His name is Joe Riley. Why might they have called him? This nickname came from white Charlestonians. Why might white Charlestonians have called Joe Riley, who was the mayor from 1975 to 2015? 40 years he was the mayor. If that doesn't define political machine, I don't know what does. How does someone like that get the nickname Little Black Joe? What do you think? Why would white people call another white person black? Yeah.
Maybe he's a human rights activist for African Americans.
Yeah, that's pretty close, actually. He would not say he was a civil rights activist, but he had more effect on civil rights than probably any activist in town. Now, would he have done what he did without those activists pushing him? No, definitely not. So I don't mean to give him credit for this, but I do mean to say that as the person in charge, as the politician that led the city in the post-civil rights era, he put into policy and practice the things that civil rights activists had been pushing for in the 60s and early 70s. So by doing so, he became what historians call, and actually people in the South sometimes call, a race traitor. That is, he actually worked across race lines. So here's an example number 1 about how race is not the only thing defining power in the South, right? You have biracial coalitions in politics that are really important in the rise of someone like Joe Riley. He's very liberal, very deep blue Democrat, like I said, and surrounded by a sea of red in the state of South Carolina. Now, look who's swearing him in. Septima Clark, civil rights activist. And that's not unintentional. I mean, that is intentional, to not use a double negative. He is trying to connect himself to that because the majority of voters in Charleston in 1975 were African American, and he needed their votes. And here's how he got them. But it wasn't just symbolism like that. Riley was important because he put policies behind the words, behind the rhetoric. He was a supporter of affirmative action. So Joe Riley hired more African Americans and women in city government than all the previous mayors of Charleston combined. Now, Charleston was founded in 1690. So between 1690 and 1975, if you put all the African Americans and women who were hired by the city in one room, well, they'd be dead, but if you put them all in one coffin, there would be more than in Riley's administration. In fact, he had hired more by the mid-'80s than all of the previous mayors combined. So that is important, again, for my thesis, because guess what that means? Those jobs are middle-class jobs. They give middle-class and even some working-class African Americans access to power. And women too, African American and white women. Now, as much as Riley could swim against the tide in city politics of the sea of red around Charleston, he was influenced by it too. And so in 1982, he hired a very conservative police chief. This police chief believed in racial profiling, explicitly so. He believed in racial profiling. Over the course of his career, he would get a potbelly, a little bit of a potbelly. So you might think he was a classic Southern sheriff or police chief, right? Except this is what he looked like. His name is Reuben Greenberg. So you can't write this history. Reuben Greenberg was the first black and the first Jew to be hired as the police chief of Charleston. His grandmother was a Jewish immigrant from Russia. Excuse me, his grandfather. Now, he was raised Methodist, black Methodist, in the Methodist church. But as an adult, he reconverted to Judaism. Now, the reason that I say all this stuff about his politics, he really was conservative, and he really did support racial profiling. So he suggests two contradictory strains of policing in the South. Reuben hired more African Americans for his force than it had ever been hired before. And he required new officers to have a college degree. So he professionalized law enforcement in town. But he was also the chief during the war on drugs. And he used racial profiling to hammer working class black communities in Charleston, black neighborhoods in Charleston, because he felt like that was the most effective way to crack down on the drug trade. So he leaves this real contradictory legacy when he retires in 2005 of someone who professionalized the force, who gave middle-class African Americans an opportunity to work in the force, diversifying it, but also kind of laying the groundwork for the kind of police brutality that you see in town today. And he gave cover for that. Because who was going to say that Reuben Greenberg was a racist? Nobody. So he could be an open advocate of racial profiling with the shield of his identity, keeping him from being criticized for it. Now, he did get criticized for it. One of the ministers, black ministers and civil rights activists I talked to said, Reuben Greenberg, when he first got hired, he was the first black police chief. When he retired, he was the first Negro police chief. Snap. That's rough. Now, this guy was a firebrand, so you got to take that with a grain of salt. But basically, what he's saying is, pictures like this suggest that race and class mixed in interesting ways in Reuben Greenberg's policing. All right, so that's the second case study. Here's the third. Schools. Now, if you've ever taken my class, most of you haven't because you're first-year students, but if you take my class, my U.S. history class, I'm going to make you tell me what the Brown versus the Board of Education decision does. Can someone remind me, because most of you know what it did. In 1954, what did the Supreme Court say in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas? Raise your hand if you know. Yeah. Yeah, it said schools have to be integrated, right? You can see how well that worked out, right? So these are pretty simple pie charts. So here, Burke High School is the main high school in downtown Charleston. James Island High School is a public, now charter high school, still public, in one of the suburbs of Charleston. And then Porter Gowd is a private high school, also in one of the suburbs of Charleston. So what do you notice from these charts? Is segregation dead? No. Why? Or how? How are schools in Charleston segregated? Yeah. By class. But are they just segregated by class? How many white people go to Burke? Very few. I'm not even sure that this 1% is accurate, actually. When I looked, there were 2 white students who went to Burke. One had transferred out in the middle of the year, and the other was expelled. So it was 100% African American. But yes, why do you say class? They're segregated by class. How can you tell the class segregation? Mm-hmm. That's. Say again? That's right. Yeah, there is no free or reduced lunch if you go to a private school because this is a federal program, federal lunch program, right? So this is your indicator of class. So this was my argument about schools in Charleston. They didn't unsegregate necessarily. They didn't integrate. Certainly downtown schools did not. Burke was a black school before Brown versus Board of Education. It was a black school after Brown versus Board of Education. It is still an African American school. But it did get more segregated. And it got more segregated by class. Because what happened is, if you looked at the economic demographics of Burke in 1954, you had a wide spectrum of African Americans. Middle class and upper class African Americans didn't have anywhere else to go. So guess what? They went to Burke. But by the 1980s and 90s, they could move to the suburbs, and they did. Middle class African Americans and upper class African Americans did, and they started sending their kids to either these public schools, which were very integrated actually. Suburban southern schools are some of the most integrated schools in the country. Or, if they were wealthy enough, they sent their kids to private schools. All right, and my last case study is state politics. Now remember I said that, sorry about that. Remember that I said there was a surprising part of the political story here, for me anyway. And here it is. In 1965, Congress passed what was called the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act basically made it so that southern states like South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi could no longer disenfranchise African Americans just because of their race. So African Americans began to register in droves in the late 60s and 70s and into the 80s and 90s. Right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, some small number of African Americans started getting elected to office. But not that many got elected to Congress from the South. And by the 1990s, the number of African Americans from the South in Congress was basically zero, from the Deep South anyway. So, in the late 80s and early 90s, Republicans in the Department of Justice, this is under George H.W. Bush, got an idea. And here's the idea. We're going to create majority-minority districts in the South. That is, districts where the majority of the population is a minority, in this case African American. More than 60% of voters in these new districts are going to be black. And they do that, they say, because look, this is a way to ensure black representation in Congress. So these are some of the districts that get drawn. This is the one in North Carolina. This is North Carolina's 12th. This is Georgia's 11th. This is the 7th district of Alabama, and then that's South Carolina's 6th, I think. I can't remember the number. Yeah, 6. Why would the Republicans do this, other than to ensure African Americans are elected? What does the Republican Party get out of creating majority-minority districts? Do you think that those minority districts are going to be represented by a Republican? No. Who are they going to be represented by? Yes, a black person. And what party will they represent? Yes, that's right. They'll represent the Democratic Party. So why in God's name would the Republican Party create districts that they knew would elect a Democratic, and not just a Democrat, but a black Democrat who's going to probably be more economically liberal than they want? Why would they do that? Yeah.
Effectively grouping them all up and wasting all their votes on one thing instead of spreading out their votes across the whole state.
That's right. They're effectively grouping them all together. Political scientists call this packing. You pack all the voters of your opposition into one district, and then they waste. That's not quite right, but that was the hope, that they would waste their votes on that one district. And then what happens to all the surrounding districts? They're red. They're more red. So you pack into one district, and then all the surrounding districts become more red. And that's exactly what happens in this state, it's what happens in this state, and it's what happens in that state. In 1992, when they first redistricted for majority-minority districts, 12 new African Americans go to Congress. The first black congressman from South Carolina is elected to this district, the 6th. He's still in Congress today. His name is James Clyburn. He represents, you can see part of that district is in Charleston. It's in the black neighborhoods of Charleston. It's also in Columbia and then what's called the Black Belt of the rural Lowcountry. And that's great for Jim Clyburn. He's the 3rd most powerful congressman in the Democratic Party. That's pretty cool. You know who else is great for? The Republican caucus in South Carolina. Because guess what? By 1994, the South Carolina delegation to Congress had flipped from majority Democrat to majority Republican. And now it's all Republican except for Jim Clyburn. And that happened in state after state. Now, you might think, well, wait a second, didn't someone challenge this? Yes, they did. They challenged this district in court. This district was so crazily drawn that there was a joke. This is I-85. This is an interstate. And there was a joke that if you drove down through this district, you could kill all the voters by just opening the doors of your big southern truck, right? Because it was so narrowly drawn here just to connect Durham and Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Charlotte, the black neighborhoods in those cities. Well, the Supreme Court said, all right, that's not constitutional. Clearly, that's crazy. But you can still draw districts like this as long as race is only one factor. So, how does that relate to my thesis? Well, race is still dictating power, right? But you do have some political elites like Jim Clyburn who have definitely gotten more power than they would have ever gotten in the civil rights era. All right, there's one last thing I want to do before I stop. That's my 4th case study. I'm going to basically be a little egocentric and read from my book, which, you know, Jason, my peer mentor, was telling me I needed elbow patches on this jacket, which I definitely do, because to pull some shit like this off where you think you're good enough to read your own words to people is just, it's outrageous. But I'm going to do it anyway. And by the end, I'm going to have you eaten out of my hand, but for sad reasons, so I'll tell you that now. So this is the picture that goes with this. All right, so as Don did, I want to give you some freebies for your lecture response before I read this. This is an example of pathos. It's also an extreme non sequitur because it has very little to do with my thesis. But this is why I wrote this book. There was one final question that I sought to answer when I set out to write this book, a far more personal one. Where am I from? I began asking that question many years ago, but the inquiry gained more urgency at the end of my 1-year teaching gig at the College of Charleston in 2002. Leaving Charleston for the 2nd time was bittersweet. I was moving to San Francisco to take a permanent job teaching history at Sonoma State. The night before I left Charleston, I stood at the kitchen sink peeling shrimp with my mom. That's a picture over there. We were making shrimp and grits, one of the simplest and best low-country dishes. I'm just afraid that I won't get to see my grandchild grow up, my mom explained, using the time-honored parental guilt trip. Never mind that there was no grandchild yet. The grits boiled, the shrimp cooked, and I stewed. A few years later, there was a grandchild, one who didn't get to see her grandmama nearly as much as she should have. I started to work on this book. Research trips and family vacations became attempts to bridge the thousands of miles between San Francisco and Charleston. They gave my daughter and her grandmama a chance to get to know each other. After these visits to the Lowcountry, my daughter would come back to California with just the hint of a Southern accent. A genteel Charleston one, of course. On one trip to visit us in California, my mom seemed tired. It was more than just jet lag. She had a persistent cough, and she napped more than her granddaughter. Not long after she got back to Charleston, the doctors gave my mom the bad news. She had stage 4 cancer. The rest of her life would be measured in months, not decades. On one of my visits home to help care for my mom, she asked if I would make shrimp and grits for dinner. It had been almost exactly 10 years since we stood at her kitchen sink peeling shrimp together the night before I moved away. This time, however, my mom was too weak to get out of bed to help. Cancer, chemo, and radiation had taken their toll. I stood at the sink, peeling the shrimp, angry and alone. That night, after my mom fell asleep and I cleaned up from dinner, I went to work on this book. Thank you very much. That's it. I'll see you at the round table.